Some moments don't arrive with noise. They don't warn you, don't prepare you, they simply appear, quiet and ordinary, until a single line changes everything. Not shouted, not explained, just written. And in that instant something shifts. Not outside, but within. Imagine giving years of your life to something you never questioned. Showing up, standing strong, believing that when the moment truly mattered, you would be there. Not because you asked for it, but because it was understood, because some bonds aren't supposed to be spoken, they're supposed to be lived, and then, one day, without confrontation, without closure, that understanding is replaced with something else, something distant, something final. No argument to fight, no voice to answer, just silence wrapped in a sentence that leaves more questions than words. But this isn't a story about heartbreak alone. It's not about anger or regret or even loss in the way you might expect. This is a story about what happens after the silence, about what is realized when everything you thought was certain begins to unravel, about the kind of strength that doesn't shout but changes everything. Because sometimes the most powerful moments don't come from what we say or do in the heat of emotion. They come from what we choose when the world expects us to break. And by the end of this story, you won't just be thinking about what happened, you'll be questioning what you would have done in the same place. The email didn't arrive with noise or warning, it slipped in quietly like something insignificant, buried between ordinary notifications. But the moment those words were read, everything else faded into the background. A single line carried the weight of years, casual, detached, almost polite in its indifference. It wasn't just a message, it was a decision already made, a door already closed, the kind of message that doesn't ask, doesn't explain, doesn't hesitate, just informs, cold. Final. At first it didn't even feel real. The mind tried to reinterpret it, to soften the edges, to find some hidden meaning that wasn't there. Maybe it was a mistake, maybe there was more coming, maybe it wasn't meant to sound like that. But the more those words settled in, the clearer they became. There was no confusion, no misunderstanding, just a blunt reality delivered without emotion. And that's what made it cut deeper. Not anger, not even rejection at first, just shock. The kind of shock that freezes you in place, where time seems to slow down but your thoughts race uncontrollably. Memories start flashing uninvited. Small moments, big sacrifices, sleepless nights, silent efforts that were never meant to be counted. All of it rises at once, clashing violently with the present. How does something built over years get reduced to a single distant sentence? How does a bond that once felt unbreakable become something so easily set aside? There's a strange silence that follows that kind of realization, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, suffocating kind. The kind where even breathing feels different. No tears come immediately, no dramatic reaction, just a hollow stillness, as if the body itself is trying to process something the heart refuses to accept. It's not just about being excluded, it's about how effortlessly it was done. No confrontation, no conversation, just a quiet erasure. And in that moment, something shifts, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. The shock doesn't disappear, it settles. It roots itself somewhere inside, transforming from disbelief into something colder, sharper. Not an explosion, but a quiet awakening. The realization that what was just read wasn't just an email, it was a message about value, about place, about where one truly stands when it matters most. The tone of the message was what made it unforgettable. Not the words themselves, but how they were delivered, flat, distant, stripped of anything that resembled warmth. It read like a notification, not a message between two people who once shared years of closeness. There was no hesitation in it, no softness to cushion the impact, no trace of emotion that might suggest this decision carried any weight on the other side. Just a calm, almost mechanical sentence, as if it had been written, reread, and finalized without a single flicker of doubt. That coldness does something different than anger ever could. Anger at least carries energy, a sign that something still matters. But this felt like absence. Like the emotional connection had already been turned off long before the message was sent. Every word felt carefully chosen to avoid engagement, to keep distance intact. There was no invitation for discussion, no opening for response, no room left for misunderstanding. It wasn't a conversation, it was a conclusion. What made it heavier was the contrast. The memory of laughter, of shared moments, of a time when even small conversations carried warmth, made this detachment feel almost unreal. It raised questions that had no immediate answers. When did the tone change? When did familiarity turn into formality? Because this wasn't just a shift in words, it was a shift in relationship, the kind that doesn't happen overnight, but reveals itself all at once in a single moment like this. Reading it again didn't change anything. If anything, the distance became more obvious. The phrasing stayed consistent, polite enough to avoid sounding cruel, yet distant enough to feel like a deliberate wall. It was the kind of politeness strangers use, not family. And that realization settled deeper than the message itself, because it meant this wasn't impulsive, it was intentional. There's a particular kind of sting in being addressed like that by someone who once spoke with unfiltered closeness. It creates a quiet disorientation, where the past and present no longer align. You start to wonder not just about the message, but about everything leading up to it, whether the distance had been growing unnoticed, or whether it had been ignored. But the tone leaves little room for interpretation. It speaks clearly without raising its voice, delivering a message that isn't just about the event, but about the emotional distance that now defines the connection. Being excluded from such a defining moment doesn't arrive as a single feeling. It unfolds in layers, each one heavier than the last. At first it registers as disbelief, the mind struggling to accept that something so significant could happen without a place reserved within it. A wedding isn't just an event, it's a milestone, a moment that traditionally gathers the closest people, the ones who were there long before the celebration was even imaginable. To be absent from that circle is to be quietly told that the role once held no longer applies. Then comes the realization of replacement. Not necessarily by a specific person, but by the idea that someone else now occupies a space that once felt unquestioned. It's not always visible, not always spoken aloud, but it's felt. In the seating arrangements, in the photos that will be taken, in the stories that will be told afterward, there's an invisible outline where one should have been, now filled by someone else or left unacknowledged entirely. That absence becomes its own presence, echoing louder than inclusion ever would. There's also the weight of public perception, even if no one says anything directly. Weddings are shared experiences, discussed, remembered, sometimes even judged. The thought of others noticing the absence, of quiet questions being asked or assumptions being made, adds another layer of discomfort. It's not just a personal exclusion anymore, it becomes something that exists in the eyes of others, something that invites speculation without offering any control over the narrative. What makes it cut deeper is how easily it seems to happen. No confrontation, no visible struggle, just a quiet decision that redraws the boundaries of a relationship. It forces a reevaluation of everything that came before. Moments that once felt secure now feel uncertain, as if they belong to a different version of reality. It raises questions that don't have simple answers, about when the shift occurred and why it went unnoticed until it was too late to address. And underneath it all is a subtle but persistent feeling of being set aside. Not loudly rejected, not dramatically pushed away, but calmly, almost effortlessly removed from a place that once felt permanent. That quiet removal lingers not because it demands attention, but because it doesn't. There's something uniquely humiliating about being told to witness a deeply personal moment from a distance, reduced to a viewer instead of a participant. A live stream isn't just a technological substitute. It becomes a symbol of separation, a clear line drawn between those who belong in the moment and those who are expected to stay outside of it. It transforms what should have been an invitation into a quiet exclusion, dressed up to look convenient, almost thoughtful, but carrying an entirely different meaning underneath. Watching through a screen strips away more than physical presence. It removes the ability to feel the atmosphere, to be part of the subtle, unspoken exchanges that make such an event meaningful. The laughter that echoes differently in person, the small glances, the shared emotions that ripple through a room. All of it becomes flattened, distant, untouchable. And while others sit together, connected by proximity and shared experience, the one watching remotely becomes an observer, disconnected from something they were once central to. What deepens the humiliation is the implication behind the suggestion. It's not just about logistics or convenience, it quietly communicates where one stands. Important enough to be informed, but not important enough to be present. Included just enough to avoid complete silence, but excluded enough to make the boundary unmistakable. It creates a strange contradiction. being acknowledged yet simultaneously pushed away. There's also an unspoken expectation that comes with it, to accept the arrangement without resistance, to watch, perhaps even to smile, as if this version of participation is sufficient. That expectation adds another layer, because it pressures the person into maintaining composure while experiencing something deeply uncomfortable. It's not just about watching, it's about pretending that watching is enough. The act itself becomes symbolic. Sitting alone, looking at a screen, knowing that just beyond that digital barrier is a room filled with people sharing a moment that once would have naturally included you. Every frame on that screen becomes a reminder, not just of what is happening, but of where you are not. It's a quiet, controlled form of distance that doesn't need to raise its voice to make its point, because the message is already clear in the role assigned, present but not truly there. Memories don't arrive gently in moments like this. They rush in all at once, uninvited and overwhelming, filling the silence left behind by the present. Every sacrifice, every quiet decision made over the years begins to resurface, not as a list to be counted, but as a series of lived moments that once carried meaning. Late nights spent worrying, early mornings spent providing, choices made not for personal gain but for someone else's future. None of it was ever meant to be remembered like this, yet here it is, standing in sharp contrast to a single distant message. There's a particular weight to sacrifices that were given freely, without expectation of return. They were never transactional, never held over anyone's head, never even spoken about in detail. That's what makes their sudden relevance feel so disorienting. Things that were once done out of love now appear in a different light, not because their intention has changed, but because the outcome forces them into focus. It raises a quiet, uncomfortable question about whether any of it is seen, or if it all simply faded into the background over time. Moments that once felt small begin to carry more significance, teaching, guiding, protecting, being present through phases that shaped a life now moving forward without you. The first steps, the first fears, the countless in-between moments that never made headlines but built a connection piece by piece. Those memories don't disappear, they linger, vivid and detailed, making the present situation feel even more distant and difficult to reconcile. There's also a sense of disbelief tied to how easily those years seem to be compressed into something so minimal. Not erased entirely, but reduced to a quiet acknowledgement at best, or overlooked completely at worst. It's not about expecting recognition or gratitude. It's about the natural assumption that shared history carries weight, that it matters when defining present relationships. When that assumption is challenged, it creates a kind of emotional imbalance that's hard to steady, and as those memories continue to surface, they don't just bring nostalgia, they bring contrast, a clear, unavoidable comparison between what was built over time and what now stands in its place. It's not loud or dramatic, but it's persistent, settling into the background with a quiet intensity that doesn't need to demand attention to be felt. The question doesn't come all at once. It builds slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the mind resists asking it because it already senses there won't be a comforting answer. At first, it hides behind smaller thoughts, subtle doubts that flicker and disappear. But eventually, it takes shape, unavoidable and direct. Where did everything begin to change? It's not asked out loud, not directed at anyone in particular, but it lingers, repeating itself in the quiet spaces where clarity is supposed to exist. It becomes a search through time, not in a dramatic way, but in fragments. Conversations are revisited, moments replayed, decisions re-examined, not the obvious ones but the quiet, ordinary interactions that once seemed insignificant. A tone that shifted slightly, a response that felt shorter than usual, a distance that grew so gradually it never triggered alarm. None of it stood out then, but now, under the weight of the present, everything feels like it might have been a sign that went unnoticed. There's a tension in that reflection. Part of the mind tries to find a clear turning point, something concrete to hold on to, because a single cause feels easier to understand. But the reality doesn't present itself that way. There's no single moment where everything broke. Instead, it feels like a series of small, almost invisible changes that quietly reshaped the connection over time. That realization makes it harder, because it removes the simplicity of blame and replaces it with uncertainty. Doubt begins to settle in, not just about the relationship, but about perception itself. Was the closeness ever as strong as it felt, or was it misunderstood? Were the signs of distance always there, simply overlooked in favor of comfort? These questions don't come with answers, only more layers to unravel, and the more they're considered, the less stable the past begins to feel. What makes it heavier is the lack of closure within the question itself. There's no immediate response, no explanation offered, no conversation to anchor the thoughts. Just an open-ended loop, turning over and over, searching for something that might bring clarity but never quite reaching it. It becomes less about finding the exact moment things went wrong, and more about confronting the possibility that the shift happened quietly, without announcement, until it revealed itself all at once when it could no longer be ignored. There is a kind of pain that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't break through in visible ways or demand attention from the outside world. It sits quietly, almost politely, as if even in hurt, it refuses to disturb anyone else. This is that kind of pain, the silent kind, the one that comes from realizing that a connection once believed to be unshakable can be set aside without confrontation, without even a raised voice. It doesn't erupt, it settles. What makes it heavier is the absence of acknowledgement. When rejection comes with anger or conflict, at least it carries recognition, an admission that something exists strongly enough to cause friction. But this silence, this calm distance, feels different. It suggests not just separation but a kind of emotional absence, as if the bond itself has quietly lost its presence on the other side. That realization doesn't hit all at once, it seeps in slowly, filling the gaps left behind by unanswered questions. There's no clear place to direct the pain. It can't be argued with, can't be corrected in the moment, can't even be fully expressed without feeling like it might go unheard. So it stays internal, moving through thoughts instead of words. It shows up in pauses, in the way the mind drifts back to the same moment again and again, trying to understand something that doesn't offer explanation. It's not loud enough to disrupt everything, but it's persistent enough to never fully disappear. This kind of hurt also carries a sense of isolation, not because there are no people around, but because the experience itself feels difficult to share. How do you explain being quietly set aside without sounding like you're exaggerating something that was delivered so calmly? From the outside, it might not even look like rejection, but from within, it feels unmistakable. That contrast creates a distance not just in the relationship, but in the ability to communicate the depth of what's being felt, and within that silence, something begins to change. Not outwardly, not in a way that draws attention, but internally. The pain doesn't vanish, but it becomes part of a deeper awareness. One that recognizes the shift for what it is, even if no one else acknowledges it. It remains unspoken, yet undeniably present, shaping thoughts in a way that doesn't need volume to be powerful. There's a different kind of weight that comes not from what is said directly, but from the awareness of how it might be seen by others. The mind begins to wander beyond the personal moment, imagining the quiet observations, the unasked questions, the subtle shifts in perception that happen in social spaces. A wedding is never just private. It exists in a shared world where people notice who is present and who is not. And in that absence, stories begin to form, even if no one speaks them aloud. It's not always about explicit judgment. Often it's the quieter, more subtle reactions that linger longer. A glance exchanged between guests, a brief pause when someone realizes a familiar face is missing, the polite but curious question of why isn't, that trails off before being fully asked. These small moments, imagined or real, carry a kind of pressure that extends beyond the event itself. They create a sense of exposure, as if something deeply personal has been placed into a public setting without consent. There's also the awareness that narratives will exist, whether accurate or not. In the absence of explanation, people tend to fill gaps with assumptions. Some may think there was conflict, others may assume distance, and some may not think deeply at all. But the lack of control over those interpretations becomes its own source of discomfort. It's not about needing approval from others, but about knowing that a personal situation is now subject to outside perception, without the chance to shape how it's understood. What deepens this feeling is the contrast between how things appear and how they actually feel. From the outside, the event may seem complete, joyful, untouched by absence. Photos will be taken, moments captured, all presenting a version of reality that looks whole. Yet behind that image lies an invisible gap, one that only a few might notice, and even fewer might truly understand. That gap becomes a silent presence, existing alongside the celebration but never acknowledged within it. And so the mind circles back to that awareness again and again, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a quiet, persistent loop. It's not just about being absent, it's about how that absence lives in the eyes of others, shaping perceptions in ways that can't be fully seen or corrected, only imagined and carried silently. The mind rarely settles on a single explanation when something like this happens. Instead, it begins to search outward, looking for influences, for unseen forces that may have shaped the outcome. It's not always about placing blame, but about trying to understand how a connection that once felt steady could shift so drastically. And in that search, attention often turns to the people who now exist closest to the situation, those whose presence may have quietly altered the dynamic over time. It starts subtly, with questions that feel almost hesitant. Could someone else have played a role in this distance? Was there a voice, or perhaps multiple voices, that gradually reshaped perceptions, that introduced new narratives or reinforced quiet doubts? These questions don't come with certainty, only possibility. But the possibility alone is enough to take hold, because it offers a direction for the confusion, something external to consider when internal answers feel incomplete. There's a natural tendency to look at new relationships, especially those that carry significant influence. A partner, a family member from the other side, even close friends, anyone who now holds proximity in a way that once belonged elsewhere. It's not necessarily about seeing them as adversaries, but about recognizing that influence can be subtle, even unintentional. Conversations happen behind closed doors, perspectives are shared, opinions are formed. Over time, these interactions can shape decisions in ways that aren't always visible from the outside. What makes this line of thought complicated is the lack of direct evidence. There are no clear moments to point to, no explicit statements that confirm or deny the influence. It's all inferred, pieced together from changes in tone, behavior, and decisions that don't fully align with past patterns. That uncertainty keeps the mind circling, unable to settle, because every possibility feels both plausible and incomplete. At the same time, there's an awareness that focusing too much on external influence can blur the reality that the final decision still came from within the relationship itself. That balance between understanding influence and accepting agency creates tension in the thought process. It prevents the situation from being simplified into a single cause, keeping it layered, complex, and unresolved in a way that resists easy conclusions. The conflict doesn't arrive as a clear choice between anger and heartbreak, it exists as both at the same time, overlapping, contradicting, refusing to settle into one emotion. There are moments when the heat of anger rises quickly, sharp and immediate, pushing thoughts toward confrontation, toward questions that demand answers, toward a need to be heard. It feels justified in those moments, almost necessary, as if silence would mean accepting something that shouldn't be accepted. But just as quickly as it rises, it meets something heavier beneath it. That weight is heartbreak, slower but deeper. Not driven by reaction, but by realization. It doesn't push outward, it pulls inward. Where anger looks for action, heartbreak brings stillness. It reminds you of what the relationship once meant, of the closeness that makes this moment hurt in the first place. And that contrast weakens the force of anger, not by dismissing it but by complicating it. Because it's difficult to stay angry at something that is also deeply missed, the two emotions begin to interact in a way that creates tension rather than release. Anger questions, challenges, resists. Heartbreak hesitates, softens, remembers. One wants to speak, the other holds back. One looks for resolution through expression, the other fears that expression might only widen the distance. This back and forth doesn't happen in a dramatic way, it unfolds quietly, internally, often without any outward sign. But inside, it creates a constant movement, a kind of emotional friction that doesn't easily settle. There's also a sense of uncertainty tied to whichever path might be chosen. Acting on anger risks saying something that can't be taken back, turning distance into something more permanent. Leaning into heartbreak, on the other hand, risks silence, the possibility of letting something pass without being addressed at all. Neither option feels entirely right, which makes inaction feel like the only temporary balance, even if it doesn't provide any real relief. And so the conflict remains, not resolved, not clearly defined, but present. It shapes thoughts, influences reactions, and lingers beneath every consideration, creating a space where emotions don't simplify, but instead coexist in a way that makes the situation feel even more complex than it first appeared. The instinct to respond doesn't disappear. It rises almost immediately, driven by a need to correct, to question, to push back against something that feels deeply unfair. There's an urge to write back, to ask for clarity, to demand an explanation that might make sense of what doesn't. The words begin forming naturally, fueled by emotion, shaped by everything that feels unresolved. It would be easy to send them, to let the moment carry its own momentum and speak from that place of raw reaction. But alongside that instinct, something else begins to take shape, quieter, steadier, and far more controlled. It doesn't rush, it doesn't react, it observes. And within that stillness comes a realization that not every response needs to be immediate, and not every invitation for reaction deserves to be accepted. The message that was received was final in tone, not open for discussion. Responding emotionally to something that was delivered so deliberately begins to feel less like communication and more like stepping into a space where the outcome is already decided. There's a subtle shift in perspective that happens here. Instead of focusing on what could be said, the focus turns to what would actually change. Would asking questions reopen the door, or simply confirm that it's already closed? Would expressing hurt be understood, or quietly dismissed in the same distant tone? These considerations don't silence the emotions, but they reshape how those emotions are handled. The desire to speak doesn't vanish, it becomes restrained. Choosing not to beg or plead doesn't come from a lack of care, it comes from recognizing the value of self-respect within a situation that doesn't offer the same in return. There's a difference between fighting for a relationship and forcing one to acknowledge you. And in that difference lies a difficult decision: to step back rather than push forward, to hold on to dignity rather than chase validation. It's not an easy choice. It requires holding on to words that want to be spoken, resisting the pull of immediate emotional release. But in that restraint, something steadier begins to form. Not indifference, not acceptance, but control. A decision to not let the moment dictate the response, to not allow pain to shape actions in a way that might later be regretted. And that quiet decision, though invisible to others, carries its own kind of strength. The shift doesn't happen all at once. It begins in the space left behind after the initial reaction fades, when the intensity of emotion no longer clouds every thought, but doesn't disappear either. What replaces it isn't peace, and it isn't acceptance, it's something quieter, more controlled. The sharp edges of hurt and anger begin to settle into something more focused, less reactive. It's not that the feelings are gone, it's that they stop spilling over. There's a moment where it becomes clear that reacting impulsively would only give the situation more power than it deserves. That realization doesn't come from indifference, but from understanding that not every situation benefits from immediate expression. The earlier urge to respond, to explain, to question, begins to feel less urgent. In its place comes a kind of stillness that allows for observation rather than reaction. It's a shift from being inside the emotion to standing just slightly outside of it. That calmness, however, isn't empty. Beneath it, thoughts begin to organize themselves in a more deliberate way. Patterns are noticed, past moments are reconsidered with a different lens, and possibilities are explored without the distortion of heightened emotion. It becomes less about what was felt in the moment and more about what the situation actually reveals. That clarity doesn't remove the hurt, but it gives it structure, making it easier to hold without being overwhelmed by it. What emerges from that clarity is not impulsive action, but quiet intention. Decisions begin forming not out of reaction, but out of understanding. There's a recognition that whatever comes next should not be driven by the need to prove something or to seek immediate validation. Instead, it should reflect something deeper: self-respect, awareness, and a sense of control over how the situation is approached. This is where the calm becomes something more than just the absence of chaos. It becomes purposeful. It carries a certain weight, not because it is loud or dramatic, but because it is chosen. It holds back where it once would have pushed forward, it waits where it once would have rushed. And within that waiting, something begins to take shape. Not fully visible yet, but steady, deliberate, and far more powerful than any immediate reaction could have been. There's a noticeable difference between reacting and planning, and that difference begins to define everything that follows. The initial emotions may have been intense, unpredictable, and difficult to contain, but once they settle into that controlled calm, a new approach starts to take form, one that doesn't rely on impulse. Instead of letting feelings dictate the next move, there's a quiet decision to step back and think, to allow time to create space between what was felt and what will be done. This shift into quiet planning isn't obvious from the outside. There are no visible signs, no dramatic declarations, no sudden changes in behavior that would signal what's happening internally. Everything appears still, almost unchanged. But beneath that surface, thoughts are moving with purpose, not scattered like before, but deliberate, measured. Each idea is considered carefully, not just for its immediate impact, but for what it might lead to over time. There's also a sense of discipline involved in this stage. It requires holding back the urge to act quickly, resisting the temptation to respond in a way that might feel satisfying in the moment but ultimately lacks depth. Quick reactions often come with consequences that aren't fully thought through, and there's an awareness now that this situation deserves more than that. It deserves precision, not haste. Planning in silence creates an advantage that emotion never could. It allows for observation without interference, for understanding without distraction. It creates space to see things as they are, not as they feel in the heat of the moment. And in that clarity, possibilities begin to expand. Options that wouldn't have been visible before start to emerge, shaped not by reaction, but by intention. There's also a certain strength in not revealing what's being thought or considered. It removes the pressure of expectation, the need to explain or justify. It keeps control firmly in place, allowing decisions to be made without outside influence or interruption. That silence isn't empty, it's active, focused, and quietly building towards something that hasn't yet been revealed. What makes this stage powerful is not what is seen, but what is being prepared. It's a transition from feeling powerless to regaining control, not through confrontation, but through patience and awareness. And in that space where nothing seems to be happening, everything important begins to take shape. Looking back doesn't happen out of nostalgia alone, it becomes a way of reassessing everything that once felt normal. Moments that passed without question begin to take on new meaning, as if they've been quietly waiting to be re-examined under a different light. Interactions that once seemed harmless now feel slightly off, small instances where something didn't quite sit right but was ignored at the time. These aren't dramatic memories, not the kind that stand out immediately, but the subtle ones that only gain significance when viewed in hindsight. There's a growing awareness of how often certain efforts went unnoticed or unacknowledged. Not in a way that demanded recognition, but in a way that now feels uneven. Times when understanding was given without being returned, when patience was extended without being matched. These weren't counted before because they didn't need to be. But now, they begin to form a pattern, one that suggests the balance may not have been as equal as it once appeared. What makes this reflection complex is that it doesn't rewrite the past entirely. There were genuine moments of connection, real instances of closeness that can't be dismissed. But alongside them now sits a parallel realization that even within those moments there may have been signs of being taken for granted. Not intentionally, not with clear malice, but gradually, almost unconsciously, as if the presence that was always there became something expected rather than appreciated. This realization doesn't arrive with anger as much as it does with clarity. It removes the illusion of perfect balance and replaces it with something more nuanced, more honest. It becomes clear that the relationship may have relied more heavily on one side than was ever fully acknowledged. That kind of imbalance isn't always visible in the moment, especially when it's built over time through small, repeated patterns rather than obvious events. And as those patterns become clearer, they begin to connect with the present situation in a way that feels less sudden. What once felt like an unexpected shift now starts to appear as the result of something that had been developing quietly all along. Not obvious enough to confront, not urgent enough to question, but consistent enough to shape the outcome. The past doesn't change, but the understanding of it does, revealing layers that were always there, just never fully seen. There comes a point where the focus begins to shift away from the situation itself and turns inward, towards something that had been overlooked in the process of trying to understand everything else. For a while, the attention was fixed on the message, the decision, the reasons behind it, and the impact it carried. But slowly, almost quietly, another realization begins to surface, one that has nothing to do with being included or excluded, and everything to do with recognizing value that exists independently of anyone else's acknowledgement. It doesn't arrive as a sudden boost of confidence or a dramatic declaration. Instead, it builds gradually, shaped by reflection and clarity. The memories that once brought pain begin to take on a different role. They no longer serve as reminders of what was lost, but as evidence of what was given. Time, effort, care, presence. None of it disappears simply because it wasn't recognized in the way it should have been. Its worth remains intact even if it was overlooked. There's a subtle but important distinction that starts to form here. The absence of appreciation from someone else does not erase the value of what was done. It only reveals their inability or unwillingness to see it. That understanding doesn't remove the hurt entirely, but it prevents that hurt from turning into self-doubt. It creates a boundary between what belongs to the situation and what belongs to personal worth. As this realization settles in, the need for validation begins to loosen its hold. The urge to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be included starts to feel less like a necessity and more like a preference, something that would have been meaningful but is no longer required to define self-worth. That shift doesn't make the situation acceptable, but it changes how much power it holds. There's a quiet strength in reaching that point. It doesn't need to be announced or proven. It exists in the way thoughts begin to stabilize, in the way emotions no longer spiral into questioning personal value. What was once tied closely to someone else's actions now stands on its own, separate, steady. And within that separation, there's a sense of grounding that wasn't there before, something that holds firm regardless of how others choose to act. By this point, the urge to respond hasn't disappeared, but it has changed form. It's no longer driven by the need to release emotion or to demand answers in the heat of the moment. Instead, it becomes something more deliberate, more refined. The idea of a response begins to take shape not as a reaction but as a statement, something that carries meaning beyond the immediate exchange of words. It's no longer about being heard in that instant, it's about what the response represents. There's a growing awareness that words, once sent, can't be taken back. They linger, they define tone, they shape how the situation is remembered. That realization creates a pause, a careful consideration of what should be said, if anything at all. Not every truth needs to be spoken loudly, and not every feeling needs to be expressed directly to have impact. Sometimes what is left unsaid can carry just as much weight as what is written. This is where intention becomes everything. The response, if it comes, isn't meant to argue or persuade. It isn't designed to reopen a conversation that was clearly closed. Instead, it's shaped to reflect something internal: clarity, self-respect, and control. It becomes less about changing the other person's mind and more about defining one's own position within the situation. There's also an understanding that a response doesn't always have to be immediate or even verbal. Actions, or the absence of them, can communicate just as clearly. The decision of how to respond expands beyond a single message into something broader, something that can unfold over time. That possibility shifts the perspective entirely. It removes the pressure to say everything at once and replaces it with the option to express meaning in a way that isn't confined to a single moment. What begins to form is not just a reply, but a presence, a way of carrying oneself that reflects the understanding reached through everything that has been processed so far. Whether it takes the form of words or silence, it is intentional, measured, and aligned with something deeper than emotion alone. And in that alignment, the response becomes something more than communication. It becomes a reflection of who one chooses to be within the situation. There's a quiet turning point where the focus shifts from what could be said to what should be preserved. The instinct to confront, to lay everything out clearly, to demand recognition for what has been felt and experienced. It doesn't vanish, but it begins to feel less aligned with something deeper that has taken root. That deeper sense isn't about winning an argument or proving a point. It's about holding on to a kind of self-respect that doesn't rely on how the other person responds. Choosing dignity over confrontation isn't the same as avoiding the truth. It's a conscious decision to not let the situation reduce behavior to something reactive or desperate. There's an understanding that some confrontations don't lead to resolution. They only expose vulnerability to someone who may not value it. And once that is recognized, the idea of engaging in that kind of exchange begins to lose its appeal. Not because the feelings aren't valid, but because expressing them in the wrong space could diminish their worth. There's also a subtle strength in restraint. It requires more control to remain composed than it does to react impulsively. It means carrying the weight of what could be said without needing to release it immediately. That restraint doesn't silence the truth, it protects it. It ensures that whatever is eventually expressed, whether through words or actions, comes from a place of clarity rather than emotional overflow. At the same time, this choice creates a shift in how the situation is held internally. It removes the urgency to correct the other person's perspective or to seek acknowledgement. Instead, it reinforces the idea that not all misunderstandings need to be resolved externally to be understood internally. There's a kind of independence in that realization, a separation between personal truth and external validation. What makes this decision significant is that it redefines control. Control is no longer about influencing the outcome or changing someone else's actions. It's about maintaining composure, about deciding what kind of response aligns with personal values. And in choosing dignity, there's a quiet refusal to let the situation dictate behavior. It becomes less about what was done and more about how one chooses to stand in response to it, steady, composed, and unwilling to be pulled into something that compromises that inner balance. There is a kind of presence that comes not from showing up, but from choosing not to. It doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand attention, yet it carries a weight that can't be easily ignored. Absence, when it is intentional, stops being a void and starts becoming a message. Not a loud one, not one that explains itself in detail, but one that leaves space for realization to grow in its own time. At first, absence might seem like surrender, like stepping back without resistance. But beneath that surface, it holds a different kind of strength. It refuses to participate in a situation that has already defined its boundaries in a limiting way. It doesn't argue with those boundaries, it simply acknowledges them and chooses not to force its way through. That choice, quiet as it is, carries a clarity that words often fail to deliver. What makes absence powerful is how it shifts perception. Presence can sometimes be taken for granted, especially when it has always been consistent. It blends into the background, expected rather than recognized. But when that presence is removed, even without explanation, it creates a contrast that wasn't there before. It invites questions, not through confrontation, but through silence. It allows others to feel the space that has been left behind, a space that might have once gone unnoticed. There's also a level of control in choosing absence. It removes the need to engage in conversations that may lead nowhere, to express emotions that might not be received with understanding. Instead of placing those emotions in a situation where they could be dismissed, it holds them back, allowing them to exist without being diminished. That restraint turns absence into something intentional rather than passive. At the same time, absence doesn't seek to punish. It doesn't aim to create guilt or force a reaction. Its impact comes from what it represents: a boundary, a quiet acknowledgement of what has been understood. It doesn't explain itself because it doesn't need to. The meaning is carried in the choice itself. And in that choice, there is a kind of statement that doesn't rely on words to be heard. It exists in the shift it creates, in the difference between what was expected and what actually happens, leaving behind a presence that is felt precisely because it is no longer there. There comes a point where understanding alone is no longer enough, where reflection and restraint need to take shape as something more defined. That is where a boundary begins to form, not as a reaction to hurt, but as a response to clarity. It isn't drawn in anger or used as a way to push someone away, it's created to protect something that has already been tested. The realization settles in that without a boundary, the same pattern could continue, repeating itself in different forms, gradually wearing down what remains of self-respect. Setting that boundary doesn't require an announcement. It isn't about declaring rules or issuing ultimatums. It exists in choices: what is accepted, what is no longer tolerated, and what is quietly stepped away from. It's subtle, often invisible to others, but deeply felt within. It changes how situations are approached, how interactions are interpreted, and how much space is given to something that has already shown its limits. What makes this difficult is that boundaries can feel like distance, especially when they are placed where openness once existed. There's a natural hesitation, a question of whether creating that line will make things worse or close off the possibility of repair. But alongside that hesitation is a deeper understanding that without that line, there is no stability. Without it, everything remains uncertain, dependent on decisions that are no longer within reach. There's also a shift in responsibility that happens here. Instead of focusing on changing someone else's actions or hoping for a different outcome, the focus turns inward. The boundary becomes a way of taking control over what can actually be controlled. Personal response, personal availability, personal energy. It's not about rejecting the other person, it's about no longer allowing their choices to define the entire experience. And within that boundary, there is a quiet sense of grounding. It doesn't remove the past or erase the impact of what has happened, but it creates a space where those things no longer have unlimited influence. It establishes a limit, not out of bitterness but out of understanding. A recognition that respect isn't something that can be requested repeatedly. It has to be reflected in how much access is given, how much is offered, and where the line is finally firmly drawn. The day itself carries a different kind of weight when it finally arrives. It is no longer just a date on a calendar or a distant event mentioned in passing. It becomes real, immediate, unfolding in real time. Everything that was thought about, questioned, and quietly processed begins to converge into this single moment. The wedding day is no longer just about celebration. It transforms into a point where everything that has been felt internally meets the reality of what is happening externally. There's a strange stillness in the hours leading up to it. Not the kind filled with excitement or anticipation, but one shaped by awareness. Every detail imagined, every possibility considered, now exists somewhere beyond reach, happening without involvement. The mind doesn't race as much as it observes, recognizing that this is the moment where all the unspoken decisions reveal their full impact. What was once just words in a message has now taken form in an event that continues, with or without presence. At the same time, this day creates a clear contrast between expectation and reality. There was once a version of this moment that included a different role, a different place, a different sense of belonging. That version doesn't disappear. It exists alongside the present, quietly highlighting everything that has changed. The difference between the two isn't loud, but it is unmistakable. It turns the day into something more than just an event. It becomes a reflection of the shift that has taken place. What makes it a turning point is not just what is happening, but what is chosen in response to it. All the reflection, all the restraint, all the quiet planning leads here, not to control the event itself, but to define how it is faced. This is where intention becomes action, even if that action is subtle. Whether it's the decision to remain absent, to respond in a particular way, or simply to hold on to composure, the day demands a form of clarity that can no longer remain theoretical. And within that clarity, something settles. Not resolution, not complete understanding, but a sense that the situation has reached a moment where it can no longer be reshaped by thought alone. It must be lived through as it is. The day moves forward, carrying its significance not just in what it represents to others, but in what it reveals internally. A point where everything that was uncertain begins to take a more defined, undeniable form. There is a moment, often subtle and easily missed by those not paying close attention, where the shift becomes visible to others. It doesn't happen through a dramatic announcement or an obvious disruption, but through small realizations that begin to surface in the minds of those who once held a certain assumption. People who believed they understood the situation start to notice something that doesn't quite align with what they expected. It might be the absence itself, or the way it is carried, with composure rather than chaos, that causes that quiet pause in perception. What creates the impact isn't noise, but contrast. When someone anticipates a reaction, anger, confrontation, visible hurt, and instead encounters calm distance, it unsettles that expectation. It forces a reconsideration, not just of the situation, but of the person at the center of it. That calmness doesn't explain anything directly, yet it raises questions that didn't exist before. It suggests that there is more beneath the surface than what was initially assumed. There's also a kind of unspoken communication that happens in these moments. Without saying a word, a message is delivered through behavior, through the way the situation is handled. It doesn't accuse, it doesn't defend, but it stands in quiet contrast to whatever narrative may have been formed. And because it isn't loud or defensive, it becomes harder to dismiss. It lingers in the background, prompting others to reassess their understanding at their own pace. For those who underestimated the depth of what was at stake, this realization can feel unexpected. Not because something new has been introduced, but because something that was always there is now being seen differently. The strength that was once overlooked becomes visible, not through force, but through restraint. The absence of reaction becomes its own kind of presence, one that speaks without needing to explain. And in that shift of perception, something changes, not necessarily in the outcome of the situation, but in how it is viewed. Assumptions lose their certainty, quick judgments begin to soften, and a space opens where understanding might begin to form. It's not immediate and it's not guaranteed, but it exists. And that existence alone creates an impact that goes beyond words, shaped not by what was said, but by what was quietly, unmistakably shown. Revelations rarely arrive with perfect timing, yet when they do surface in moments like this, they carry a weight that reshapes everything around them. It isn't always a dramatic secret or a shocking truth spoken aloud in front of everyone. Sometimes it's quieter than that, unfolding in a way that forces people to reconsider what they thought they understood. The impact doesn't come from volume, but from clarity, something that shifts perception in an instant, even if the full meaning takes longer to settle. What makes a revelation powerful in this context is how it intersects with expectation. By this point, most people have already formed their own version of the story. They've filled in gaps, drawn conclusions, and settled into a comfortable narrative that feels complete. A revelation disrupts that comfort. It introduces something that doesn't fit neatly into what was assumed, creating a kind of pause where certainty used to exist. That pause is where its real impact begins. It doesn't need to accuse or defend to be effective. In fact, its strength often comes from the way it simply exists, undeniable and clear, leaving others to process it on their own terms. Whether it's a truth about past actions, an overlooked detail, or even a gesture that carries deeper meaning than expected, it changes the way everything is seen moving forward. Moments that once seemed straightforward are suddenly reinterpreted, and decisions that appeared simple take on new complexity. There's also an element of timing that amplifies its effect. When something is revealed, at a moment where emotions, expectations, and attention are already heightened, it doesn't just add to the situation, it redirects it. It shifts focus, even if only internally, forcing those present to hold two realities at once, what they believed and what is now being understood. That contrast creates a kind of tension that lingers long after the moment itself has passed, and within that shift, something irreversible happens. Once a perception is changed, it cannot fully return to what it was before. Even if nothing outwardly changes, the understanding beneath it has been altered. The revelation doesn't need to resolve everything or provide closure. Its role is simply to bring something into the light that can no longer be unseen, quietly transforming the way the entire situation is held in the minds of those who witness it. Reactions don't always unfold in a way that is visible to everyone at once. Sometimes they happen in layers, beginning internally before they ever reach the surface. In a moment like this, the realization doesn't necessarily arrive as an immediate outward response. It starts quietly, almost imperceptibly, as something shifts beneath the composure that has been carefully maintained. The expression might not change right away, the posture may remain steady, but something deeper begins to register. There's a pause that carries more meaning than words could. It's not hesitation in the usual sense, but a kind of internal recalibration. What was once certain no longer feels as solid. The narrative that had been accepted without question starts to loosen, making space for something unexpected to settle in. That pause can be brief or extended, but its presence signals that something has been understood differently than before. What makes this reaction significant is not its intensity, but its depth. It doesn't need to be dramatic to be powerful. A subtle shift in attention, a glance that lingers a moment longer than usual, a silence where there might have once been ease. These small changes carry weight because they reflect an internal process unfolding in real time. It's the mind catching up with something the heart has just begun to recognize. There's also a tension that comes with that realization. It doesn't immediately resolve into clarity or action. Instead, it creates a space where multiple thoughts exist at once. What was believed, what is now being considered, and what it might mean moving forward. That space isn't comfortable, but it's necessary. It's where understanding begins to take shape even if it's incomplete, and within that moment something shifts that cannot be entirely undone. Even if everything on the surface continues as planned, even if no words are spoken and no immediate changes are made, the internal landscape has already been altered. The way things are seen, the way they are felt, carries a new layer that wasn't there before. That quiet realization, though contained, becomes part of everything that follows, influencing thoughts and decisions in ways that may not be immediately visible but are undeniably present. Closure doesn't always arrive as a clear, satisfying conclusion. It doesn't tie everything together neatly or answer every question that once demanded attention. In situations like this, it takes on a quieter form, less about resolution and more about understanding. It emerges not from external validation or a final conversation, but from an internal shift that redefines how everything is held moving forward. There's a moment where the need for answers begins to lose its urgency. The questions may still exist, but they no longer carry the same weight. They stop pulling at every thought, stop demanding immediate clarity. Instead, they settle into the background, acknowledged but no longer controlling. That change doesn't come from receiving explanations, it comes from accepting that some explanations may never come in a way that fully satisfies. What replaces that need is a clearer sense of what has been learned. Not in a forced or overly optimistic way, but in a grounded, realistic understanding of what the situation revealed. It becomes less about what went wrong and more about what is now known. About the relationship, about its limits, about what can and cannot be expected. That understanding creates a kind of stability that wasn't there before, even if it's built on difficult truths. There's also a subtle release that happens here. Not a dramatic letting go, but a gradual loosening of emotional attachment to the outcome. The event, the message, the reactions, all of it begins to take on less immediate intensity. It becomes part of the past, not erased or forgotten, but no longer actively shaping every present thought. That shift creates space, a kind of emotional distance that allows for clarity without constant interference. Closure in this form doesn't depend on reconciliation or acknowledgement from the other side. It stands on its own, rooted in personal clarity rather than shared agreement. It doesn't require everything to be fixed or understood by everyone involved. It simply requires enough understanding to move forward without carrying the same weight. And within that space, there is a quiet sense of completion. Not because everything ended perfectly, but because it no longer needs to continue in the same way. The situation stops being something that demands attention and becomes something that has already given what it needed to give, leaving behind a clearer, steadier perspective that doesn't need to be questioned in the same way anymore. Walking away doesn't always look like movement. Sometimes, it happens internally long before it is ever visible on the outside. By the time this point is reached, there is no urgency left to prove anything, no lingering need to revisit what has already been understood. What once felt heavy, consuming, and impossible to ignore now sits at a distance. Not erased, not forgotten, but no longer in control. There is a quiet strength in that distance. It isn't built on denial or indifference, but on everything that has been processed along the way. Every question that was asked, every emotion that was faced, every realization that settled over time, has contributed to this moment. It's not a sudden transformation, it's the result of gradually seeing things as they are and adjusting accordingly. That clarity becomes a foundation, something steady enough to stand on without hesitation. What makes this stage different is the absence of conflict within. The earlier tension, the back and forth between holding on and letting go, begins to fade. Not because the past has changed, but because the need to engage with it in the same way has disappeared. There's no longer a pull to return to what was, no desire to rewrite or renegotiate what has already revealed itself. That release doesn't come with bitterness, it comes with acceptance of reality, even if that reality once felt difficult to face. There's also a shift in identity that happens here. The situation no longer defines the sense of self. It becomes something that was experienced, not something that continues to shape every thought or decision. That separation creates space for something new, not necessarily immediate change, but the freedom to move forward without carrying unnecessary weight. And in that quiet movement forward, there's a sense of composure that speaks for itself. No explanations are needed, no final statements required. The strength lies in the ability to leave without disruption, to step away without needing acknowledgement or approval. It's a kind of closure that doesn't announce itself, but is evident in the way everything settles into place. What remains is not the intensity of what happened, but the clarity it left behind. A steady awareness of what is deserved, what will no longer be accepted, and what it means to stand firm in that understanding without needing to look back. In the end, this was never just about a wedding, or an email, or a single moment that seemed to change everything. It was about understanding what remains when expectations fall away. It was about facing silence, distance, and difficult truths without losing composure. What began as shock turned into reflection, and what felt like rejection slowly revealed something far more important: clarity. Not every story finds its resolution in reconciliation. Not every bond returns to what it once was. But there is a different kind of ending, one that doesn't rely on others to feel complete. It comes from seeing things as they are, without illusion, without denial, and choosing to move forward with that understanding intact. There is strength in that kind of ending. quiet, steady, and unshaken by what could not be controlled. Some absences speak louder than presence ever could. Some decisions, though painful, reveal more truth than years of comfort, and sometimes, the most powerful response is not spoken at all. It is lived, carried forward in the way one chooses dignity, self-respect, and peace over anything that tries to diminish it. If you've listened this far, thank you for being part of this journey. Stories like these are not just about what happens, but about what they leave behind in all of us. A reminder of resilience, of clarity, and of the quiet strength it takes to stand firm when everything else shifts. Wishing you strength in your own journeys, clarity in your decisions, and the courage to choose yourself when it matters most. Good luck, and thank you for listening.